Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 406, Some Work for Immortality. Now, this is going to be a very interesting poem for us because, one more time, we've got a poem about poetry, and we've got a poem about writing of poetry, and more importantly, possibly, a poem about publishing or sharing poetry. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments where we commented on, for example, Emily's reluctance to publish or her desire at times to publish, and the goal is always going to be accepted in some way. This, we'll see this actually coming pretty quickly with poem 441. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. For love of her sweet countrymen judged tenderly of me. In other words, there's this constant desire for Emily to be somehow accepted within the larger community of poets. I'm hopeful as well that you've already read the preceding 405 poems. We just finished with 405. It might be lonelier. And if you have, then you know that she has come across this position several times of, do I want my stuff out there? Do I want to be a part of the community of, especially she would call them lady poets, those especially poets who were lady poets publishing, for example, in the Springfield Republican, where she gave some consideration. Now, the scholar Wolf will see this in this poem, Emily, as a haughty speaker. Certainly the tone is going to be powerful, I think, as we read this. It is another comparison poem. Emily compared to those others. She is working for immortality. They are working for something else. She says it this way. Some work for immortality, the chiefer part for time. He compensates immediately, the former checks on fame. Slow gold, but everlasting, the bullion of today, contrasted with the currency of immortality. A beggar here and there is gifted to discern beyond the broker's insight one's money, one's the mine. Now, notice we'll begin with the word some. And notice she doesn't say some poets or some writers or some artists, but it's fairly clear as we get into the poem, she is juxtaposing the way she sees her life's work with others. Some work for immortality. It is significant that she will use this word 42 different times in 42 different poems. I'll just mention 1732 because it's right at the end of our study together. She'll say it this way, my life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Now, this idea of immortality, and we're going to come back to it obviously here in a little bit, she says is what some work for, right? The chiefer part for time, longevity maybe. And then he, we're assuming time, compensates immediately. In other words, there are some people who are immediately recognized as great, and then there are others that will only be recognized much later. Obviously, Emily is a prime example of this today. We cannot help, I mean, guys, we are now, 406 poems into the Johnson edition. And I shudder to imagine that anybody could have been doing this study with us and imagine that Emily is not the most amazing of poets that they've read. Notice, it will happen sometimes, but it usually happens much, much later. For some, it happens right away. He compensates immediately. The former checks on fame. Now, fame is used in 32 different poems for Emily. 1659, 1763, 1475, 866, 713, and 1066. The word is actually in the very first line of the poem. I'll not read any of those, but you can run them to ground. It is fascinating. And then she'll use the word slow. So in other words, there are some who gain fame quickly, others slow, and then she'll call it gold. Notice all of the in economic language of this poem. Slow, gold, but everlasting. And obviously this is the immortality that she's hoping for, that she'll mention again at the end of the stanza. The bullion of today, maybe she's speaking of the Springfield Republican, that of course is paying some lady writers at the time contrasted with the currency of immortality. Again, Emily's ability to turn a phrase is quite remarkable. What is it that Emily longs for? The currency of immortality. In other words, all those lady poets, to use the language of Emily, that were publishing during her lifetime in the Springfield Republican, nobody other than scholars today know any of those. And yet, lots of folks obviously appreciate the poetry of Emily Dickinson. She'll say it this way: a beggar, maybe herself, here and there is gifted to discern. I like this word gifted. I think she chose it intentionally. Beyond the broker's insight, again, more economic language. And then she'll say it: one's money. Notice the use of the dash here to make her point. One's the mind. In other words, the source, the fountainhead, if you will, is the goal for Emily. She's not so interested in the money. She's interested in the mind, the source of inspiration. Now, when we get to poem 709, we'll have to come back to this one because this is one of those really famous poems about publishing. She says in 709, publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty by justifying for so foul a thing. Possibly, but we would rather from our garret go white unto the white Creator than invest our snow. Thought belonged to him who gave it, then to him who bare its corporal illustration. Sell the royal air. In the parcel be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. Emily once said, quote, I would as soon undress in public as to give my poems to the world, end quote. Well, what am I going to do with this poem of 406? I think her argument is it's better as an artist, creator, to work slow and not worry about the fame. Let time decide how that will work itself out. It to be the economic language is immediate here for us. I like to, at 3a, think about Keats and his When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. You'll remember Keats, who instructed that on his tombstone would be written the words, here lies one whose name was writ in water. And we've given full set of instructions and lectures on Keats and his poetry at learnstrong.net. You'll remember, though, that he says at the end of When I Have Fears, that on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink. And yet, of course, we know that Keats struggled, longing for both of those things, love and fame. I also would like to think about the Upanishadic tradition and the Bhagavad Gita. And Gita, too. We've made comments on this elsewhere at learnstrong.net. But you'll remember that Krishna will point out there in the Gita 2 passage, you have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. And then, of course, he finishes by saying, never give way to laziness either. I think Emily is trying to remind us of why creative people really fundamentally want to be creative. And it's not about fame. It can't be about that level of immediate fame, but immortality. Finally, at 3b, what are your feelings about fame and the quest to be known and to be remembered? I hope that you're enjoying your study of Emily. Thank you.